body was found there, but they weren't sure if it was Catherine's or not.
Paul Novak was a highly regarded paramedic.
This is somebody who had won a lot of awards for life-saving measures. He had volunteered after 9/11.
Something had happened to Catherine.
Catherine, she was a born volunteer, a giver, and there aren't a lot of people like that, and communities depend on them.
She took care of people that were down in their luck. She cared for people that needed fixing. She wanted to put the energy into making better.
I actually found out that they found a body in the basement from my mother, who found out from one of the volunteer firefighters that was there.
They discovered this house that is completely torched. I mean, it is absolutely completely torched.
Pretty much everything that could be brought to light was brought to light.
The whole story really hinges on this underworld or this community of paramedics.
I'm an adult, I'm a man, and I have to take responsibility for what I was part of. Fortunately for Catherine and her children, what I did was wrong. There doesn't a day go by that I wish I had nothing to do with this. And then I wish Catherine was still alive.
From the first minute that I met Scott Sherwood, I found him to be a kind and nice person, very scared of being in the situation that he was in, but a good person. You can't just take what the facts are and put them in a vacuum. It's also who the person is. Scott Sherwood was a paramedic for years, devoting his life to helping people.
Scott Sherwood's lawyer essentially is alleging that his client fell victim to an evil force.
If someone is good enough and they have a strong enough desire, you can manipulate most people to do most things. You can manipulate even good people to do the wrong thing. And you just need someone with some very twisted morals to do that.
Scott Sherwood does seem like somebody who would be a sympathetic character in many ways. He would be the perfect person to take advantage of in a lot of respects.
One, you have Mr. Sherwood, who always wants to do the right thing and always is a caring and generous person. And then you have a person like Paul Novak.
Two medics working together at a New York hospital. One good, one bad. One certainly not the hero of 9/11 as he once appeared to be.
Individuals who are working together in high-risk situations, life-saving situations, I think there is a bond that is difficult to describe outside of that. We see that with people in the military who are in combat together. We see this in emergency services, where people are riding an ambulance day in and day out, saving lives.
The plan came out in probably November, December probably. It was very short time. Up there in the middle of nowhere, and nobody would know, nobody would see it.
Tiny little town, quite opposite in every way you can imagine from Queens.
It's just a very stable, kind of quiet, almost a farming kind of community.
It was Christmas, and we were actually having a holiday dinner at a friend's house outside of Narrowsburg, and the local paper was on the table, and I looked at it, and there was a color picture on it of a fire or a charred house, and underneath it said, "A local woman dies in fire." And I read the first line of the story, and there was her name.
We're in a very small town, and people notice things in a small town. And so these neighbors are absolutely horrified at what has happened. They're probably a little bit scared. They're a little bit confused.
I immediately thought, oh my God, she was murdered. It's a place where things can happen because it's a rural community and you're far from neighbors, you're far from the authorities, and on a dark night, a lot of things can happen if you have somebody with malign intent. They started digging, and by the afternoon they had come to the basement level of the house, and they found Catherine's body on the floor and the dog in a kennel, also dead.
There were so many just unusual details and so much mystery. I mean, how did Catherine end up in the basement? How did the dog get there? You know, why was the dog there? What started this fire? I think the neighbors are just absolutely horrified, and I think they're mystified.
Catherine's death left a hole in the community. It's just heartbreaking. That mother loved her children, and they are motherless. It's terrible.
Paul and Catherine met in 1996 at a barbecue. They had a relatively short courtship. At the beginning, things were very, very happy. Catherine was raised with her parents and with 3 older brothers. She lived in a suburb, though, of New York. And I think one of the things that really kind of hit home is just the lack of financial resources they have.
Catherine is a very caring person. She looks at how to make things better, and she tries to make it that way, sometimes at her own expense. Paul is a highly regarded paramedic. He was the recipient of some prestigious awards, and he's viewed as being very competent and capable at his job. Catherine decided that she didn't want to live in the city anymore, and it was best for their lives and family and finances to move far outside where it was cheaper. In Narrowsburg, Catherine becomes so enmeshed in the community. She volunteers at the church, she works at the school, she even babysits for her neighbors' kids. This is something that is idealistic for Catherine.
I met Catherine when both of our children were 5-year-old kindergartners at the Narrowsburg school, and she was just a mother, just like me. She had a 5-year-old and she had a toddler. She was a great mother. She sometimes babysat for my kids. I would bring my son over to play with her daughter, and our toddlers would play together.
It's like this fantasy she had her whole life of living this stable kind of place and raising her kids in this amazing location are coming true. She's a volunteer. She volunteers for everything. Paul, it is the epitome of boredom. He has no interest in settling down. He loves racing motorcycles. He loves everything about kind of the adrenaline part of it.
He would show up on occasion to the morning drop-off wearing his uniform. And in those days, right after 9/11 and at the very early years of the Iraq War, anyone with a paramedic uniform on from New York, you kind of assumed might have been a hero. The real Paul Novak was cold, not social, had a porn addiction, was reckless in the extreme, was an adrenaline addict.
His porn addiction, which many of his workers talked about as just being incredibly prevalent. He's doing it on the job. And that just speaks, I think, to this addiction that he had for this ongoing kind of stimulation. In this case, it was sexual, but then we have evidence that it was for speed, it was for all kinds of things. So I think that does speak to somebody whose need for thrills and stimulation is driving him. Rationalize it and justifies it by saying, hey, I can make more money here, I'll just commute, and those kinds of things. But some of the things that Catherine's neighbors point out is that he just doesn't show any interest at all in what's going on with his wife or in any way integrating into this small community.
I would see him on occasion at the school dropping off the children or at an assembly that the kids had. Even the times that I would maybe drop off a kid at her house or interact with her at her house, I don't recall ever seeing him in that little cottage. I really don't recall him being particularly social or sociable. We didn't talk that much.
At this point, Paul is working in the city 5 days a week. He sees his wife and kids at most 2 days a week. Catherine has really distanced herself from the life they once had as EMTs together.
She gets a call one night from a woman who she doesn't know, who clearly appears to have been drinking, who is asking for her husband. And I think at that point, perhaps for the first time, this light bulb goes off in Catherine's head, and she realizes that her husband was having an affair. She was kind of an intern. She started riding along sometimes with Paul. Here is this 25 young, attractive woman. Here is Paul, who's essentially living the bachelor life. So the two meet each other. She rides along with him, and she's looking up to him. He's probably flattered by the attention she's giving him.
She's junior to him. She's got a troubled past. She has had several emotional issues come out. She's attempted suicide, and she's had this streak of a wild flare.
It does seem like this is somebody who has had a history of suicide attempts. Just somebody that we don't typically think about who is an EMT or in that line of profession. But what we do know is that, she does eventually become an EMT. Paul is dazzled by Michelle, just dazzled by her.
She told me that It was one of those terrible times in the winter where everybody had the stomach flu and her kids were sick, and then she got sick. She had called him and asked him to come back from the city because, it's hard to take care of kids when you're sick. Paul Novak was cold and calculating and had been talking to his fellow paramedics about how much he didn't like his wife, how happy he would be if he could get rid of her.
She is living there with her 2 children and raising them pretty much as a single parent. And their dog is there. But I do think within a relatively short period of time, Paul saw this almost more as a convenient and a plus for him because he could live these 2 separate lives. He was happy that he had the opportunity to basically have the best of both worlds if he wanted it. He can go, he can live in New York, he can live a bachelor life if he wants to. And he can get all the excitement he wants to, and then he can come up whenever he feels like it to the small town where everything is peaceful.
It was a late summer afternoon. The sun was setting over the Delaware River. It was one of those afternoons where the light is golden. All of a sudden, this van pulled up at the bottom of the stairs outside of our yard on the street, and out bounded Catherine and her daughter. And I said, hello, and we kind of chit-chatted, and right away she said, well, I've been looking for you because my husband's having an affair and I need to get a job. I said, oh, I'm sorry. And she sort of giggled and acted like it didn't matter that much that he was having an affair, didn't go into any of the details, and just said, I need to get a job.
Catherine, I think, was a quiet person. I think she wasn't somebody who would bend her friends' ears about what was going on. And so I think at the beginning, she tried to really kind of muster through it and act like it didn't matter that much to her. It's hard to imagine how shocked I think Catherine was. In spite of the fact there had been this separation, they'd kind of been living in 2 different places. I think some of her friends had some inklings. But for whatever reason, I think Catherine, either because she couldn't see it or she didn't want to see it, really did maintain this belief that, everything was fine.
At this point, when Paul's really making some major changes in his life, he's getting divorced from Catherine, he's moving to Queens with Michelle, this is when Scott Sherwood comes into his life. Scott Sherwood is this gentle giant. He comes to meet Paul. They start discussing their own lives. He, too, is a fellow paramedic.
Scott Sherwood is really, in some respects, a tragic figure in some of this. He's somebody, I think, who was struggling on his own. He had a history of mental illness.
I thought he was a person that you wouldn't mind living next door to you, a person that was kind-hearted. Anyone that got to know him for 5 minutes would know that he was a good person.
Scott shares that he's recently gone through a divorce, and it was not just emotionally damaging for him, but it almost financially ruined him too.
I think he felt angry and hurt that he was paying child support and alimony, and yet felt like he wasn't able to see his child. So I think he was in a very vulnerable place in his life.
At this point, Paul thinks that because Catherine is going along with the divorce, this is going to be a quick and easy process, that he can move on with his life and be with Michelle and everything will be as it was. But Scott is the first person that tells him that's not likely the case, that this is not going to be so easy and it's likely going to cost him.
He had been talking about researching the perfect crime, how to hide a body.
On the cold December morning in Narrowsburg, a neighbor sees what they think is the early part of a sunrise coming up.
But somebody nearby recognized it was a fire and called the police.
It was Catherine's house, completely engulfed in flames. By the time they called 911 and the fire trucks came out, there was basically no house remaining. The question on everyone's lips is, where is Catherine? When investigators arrive, they first make sure the fire is completely put out and they go downstairs. And this is where they find Catherine's body. She's laying on her back, her legs are spread eagle. She's clearly dead, but it's impossible to tell at this point from how she died. Her dog, Aladdin, is in his crate, and sadly, he's dead too.
I think the neighbors are just absolutely horrified, and I think they're mystified. They have no idea what's happened. It's a time of the year when it's cold, and yet this fire is absolutely raged. It took hours for the police to put it out. They're in this rural community, this very, very small town. And so this is something that is so atypical for this community.
The local paper was on the table, and I looked at it, and there was a color picture on it of a charred house, and underneath it said, "A local woman dies in fire." I read the first line of the story, and there was her name.
Even though as horrible as that is just devastating as it is, they realize it could have been much worse, because they find out that their two children are not there.
Typically, particularly in rural communities, there's a sense of safety and security because all neighbors know each other. People leave their doors unlocked.
I talked to some people that I knew, and I asked what they had heard. And the person I was talking to said, "Oh yeah, everybody here is very suspicious about that. You should talk to her pastor." So I called that person, and she also indicated that she was suspicious about it.
For one, they realized that the dog was in the kennel, and this would not be normal if Catherine was at home, the dog would be out and about. He'd also be out protecting her, so why was this not the case? Catherine was lying on her back, not near any exit, and she was spread eagle. This is completely different from how most people that die from fires and suffocation due to the smoke are found. They're often found in more of a fetal position as they're trying to escape the smoke.
Catherine's death was really devastating to the small community. Not only because she was such a lovely person to her friends, but she was such a pillar of the community. And I think maybe because of the impact that she had on this community, I think they were wanting to know what happened more than normal.
There's someone who arouses a lot of suspicion, and it's Catherine's estranged husband, Paul Novak.
I remember picking up the phone and calling the state police and saying, "You're aware, of course, that she was, engaged in a divorce."
They were suspicious of this person who they hardly ever saw. And when he did show up, he didn't show any interest in them or make any effort. They knew, because she had mentioned that they were going through divorce, that he was having an affair.
Another thing is that neighbors knew that there was this feud essentially going on between Catherine and Paul. This wasn't just an amicable divorce.
So I actually found out that they found a body in the basement from my mother.
Even though there was all the suspicion after Catherine died, it was a very, very difficult situation for them. Nobody could put Paul Novak at the scene. There didn't seem to be any physical evidence tying him to the scene. They talked to him. He denied being there. Michelle LaFrance said, "What are you talking about? He was with me."
State police interviewed Paul Novak, and he had an airtight alibi. He also passed a lie detector test. So they really didn't have anything to go on.
He's so calm. He's very detached. He doesn't seem worried about this at all. This actually makes investigators think maybe they've got the wrong guy.
At that point, they told me that a body was found there, but they weren't sure if it was Catherine's or not.
He's calm. He's cool. He's collected. Taking a polygraph test is stressful. It's stressful for most people. And yet for somebody like Paul Novak, who is used to dealing with emergency situations, this probably was not that difficult for him. I wonder how stressed he really was. He sailed right through that polygraph test.
When the autopsy report comes back, there's another interesting finding. It is clear that she did not have enough carbon monoxide in her lungs to suggest that she died due to the fire. This means that she probably died from another cause.
The dog had died clearly of smoke inhalation. And yet, the autopsy showed there was a very little smoke, if any, in Catherine's lungs.
And the way they explained that was that they thought something maybe had fallen on her head.
Catherine has 3 broken ribs, and this suggests that it's possible something fell on her during the fire, and that's what led to her death. Due to the extensive fire damage, it's almost impossible to tell conclusively what killed Catherine. The case goes cold.
I just sort of filed it away as one of those things that might happen in this community.
About a year after Catherine's death, Paul Novak collects a very substantial paycheck, $300,000 for the home insurance for the house and $500,000 for Catherine.
He had taken out an extensive life insurance policy on her months beforehand. Framed it, of course, as, good for the family and those kinds of things.
I think Paul Novak only cared about Paul Novak, and he got a large sum of money from the insurance.
And moved himself and his girlfriend and his 2 kids to a house that he bought for himself in Florida.
Paul and Michelle decide that they're going to move to Florida with the kids. This is to provide them a fresh start and get away from all of the drama and suspicions surrounding her death. Down in Florida, Paul gets a new job dispensing medication to prisoners at a local sheriff's office, and he's still a volunteer as a local firefighter.
As far as he's concerned, his problems are over. His plan is to essentially go off into the sunset and have this perfect life.
Very soon after they were living together, they started to fight.
Just like when he's with his wife, he finds Michelle. Now he's with Michelle, right? So Michelle is now the new Kathy. He starts meeting women online.
He is on Match.com looking essentially for the next person. He finds it. He's cheating on her. Michelle finds out and decides to end it. She's really had enough.
Eventually, she moved out of the house that she shared with him and the kids, moved into her own apartment in Florida.
After leaving Paul, Michelle moves on and meets a new partner of her own. This is a police officer, and Michelle decides that she feels much more comfortable now telling him what really happened. Michelle decides that she's going to come clean and tell exactly what happened.
That police deputy urged her to contact the New York State Police, which she then did.
Nobody would know, nobody would see you.
But the question is, will the word of a bitter ex-girlfriend be enough to charge him with the murder of his ex-wife, Catherine? Police are astounded by what they hear from Michelle.
The plan came out in probably November, December probably. It was a very short time that I knew about it.
Okay.
And he was going to do this. He was going to do this and save the children.
She says, look, I lied to you. I covered for Paul Novak. He was not with me that night. As a matter of fact, not only was he not with me, I know where he was. I knew that he was going to kill Catherine.
How did it come out? How did it happen that he told what?
I don't remember how exactly the conversation told, but he had me convinced that Catherine was the bad guy and he was the good parent, and these kids are abused and these kids are miserable, and we need to save the kids.
She claims that he manages to convince her that this was all for the children, that his wife was this horrible person, she was an abusive mother, and that this was best for everybody.
Can you see anger building up in Paul, or is Paul talking about?
Paul was very calm.
Very calm? But did he?
Very controlled, very nipped up.
When Michelle is recounting to police what happened the night of Catherine's murder, she vacillates between being very matter-of-fact and being very upset.
What is he telling you that he wants to do, or how does that come about?
That he was going to kill Catherine. He was looking into how he could do this and get this.
What happened on this December morning is that Paul went over to Catherine's house. He set the fire alarm in the basement after he entered to get her downstairs.
He was going to chloroform her, leave her, and then burn the house down around her, and she was going to die in the fire.
He goes into the house and he lures her to the basement. The chloroform does not work, and so there is an extensive 45-minute, apparently, struggle.
In the middle of nowhere, and nobody would know, nobody would see it, and,
all of his problems would be solved in his mind.
That was his plan. And we were going to do it on a weekend that, we hit the kids would be safe.
This murder of the mother occurred when Paul had custody of his children over the weekend. He had actually given them Benadryl to knock them out, to make sure they slept through the whole night so he could escape, go kill their mother, and come back without them noticing.
He had described to her how he had killed Catherine, and she couldn't get that out of her head. She had nightmares that he was coming to kill her in the way that he had killed Catherine.
This is somebody who is maybe fearful that her ex-lover may try to do the same thing to her.
Paul Novak actually asked his friend Scott Sherwood to drive him to his estranged wife's house in Narrowsburg.
Paul Novak had him drive them from Long Island up to Sullivan County and was with him while he did the acts that he did. He didn't go in the house. He didn't do other things to advance the murder beyond driving him.
What does he say happened inside the house?
He had said that the chloroform didn't work. I had to strangle her. Something about hitting the gas line to ignite.
When the chloroform doesn't work as expected, Paul and Catherine start wrestling on the floor. She's fighting for her life. He's trying to do anything to kill her and decides to take her sweatshirt and wrap it around her neck, and he strangles her to death. Novak then sets the house on fire to cover his own tracks.
What was his demeanor when he came back from the house?
Seemed cold, distant.
What about you? Were you like, holy why?
I was beside myself.
Why did he do this to Catherine?
Well, he said it to me because I don't want to end up like you.
And you having gone through a very rough divorce and are in a very difficult predicament with your ex. And obviously you're not happy about that.
Paul Novak is very manipulative, and he's good at it. He can talk people into things.
Did he say if Catherine mentioned anything during the struggle?
Why are you doing this?
And what was his response?
I'm doing this for the kids.
Paul didn't want his car to be traced to his ex-wife's house when he was going to try to murder her. So having someone else's car would be in his best interest.
Not only did he help participate in this murder, he feels very guilty because if he didn't participate, then Catherine would probably still be alive.
I think there are a million paramedics, there are thousands of paramedics who would never think that because I see dead bodies, it makes it easier for me to murder somebody. So I think this was much more about Paul Novak and his character than it was about his profession.
Did you kill your wife?
No, I didn't. And I said, do I need a lawyer? He goes, well, if you ask for a lawyer, it won't really look that good. We like you. We know you didn't have anything to do with this. But the DA wants us to ask you some questions just to keep you in the clear and make everyone feel a lot better. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, all right. I don't have anything to hide.
Paul is extremely standoffish. He thinks this is preposterous. To him, he points out that it's Michelle that's the liar, and there's no evidence to support that he did anything. And he's essentially trying to, again, manipulate the police to say, why would you even believe her?
You can ask me anything you want. That's when he told me that something had happened to Catherine.
The confidence that Paul likely has comes from not just the natural level of narcissism and grandiosity that he seems to have, but he committed murder and seemed to get away with it. That must really be a boost for him in terms of his being able to know that he's probably not going to get caught. He thinks that they did such a good job when he set the fire and killed her that it will never lead to him. So what does he have anything to be worried about?
was the longest trial Sullivan County has ever had. So pretty much everything that could be brought to light was brought to light. There was a lot of ancillary evidence where they stopped off at a store and that corroborated Scott's story. And then you had Michelle LaFrance, who testified that Paul Novak told her a great deal of things.
He had been talking about researching the perfect crime, how to hide a body, had told his friends that he thought fire was the best way to hide a body, and had left a trail of crumbs about his guilt.
Paul Novak's colleagues had some really interesting perspectives of him because this is somebody who had won a lot of awards for life-saving measures. Paul Novak was smart enough to realize that after the jury has listened to Michelle LaFrance as well as Scott Sherwood, it is not in his best interest to get up and testify on the stand and subject himself to cross-examination.
His wife at the time, 2 weeks after the murder, knew that this had happened. And she testified in court that she didn't call the police because she didn't want to get her boyfriend in trouble, which I just find astonishing. I mean, the whole story really hinges on this community of paramedics who were witnesses to Paul Novak's bizarre behavior. I think about it every time I go back past the home. She was a very unusual type because of her sense of civic duty, her willingness to plunge in, donate her time, and there aren't a lot of people like that.
One of the saddest parts of the story is that Catherine Novak was such a giving person, and that she was attracted for whatever reason to somebody who was such a taker. And that's the whole community really lost out when they lost her.
There's really no crime I've ever handled quite like this.
And I'm so torn because of the things I've done. And I got myself in such a horrible mess. So freaking evil.
A nurse with malicious intent is never something that they check for.
My Lord, you just don't think about going to the hospital and being killed.
When I saw the CCTV footage, it was clear that he was enjoying this.
And he's watching him die.
He's just watching, like it's a show.
I'm praying that they'll give me forgiveness.
It's just not anybody's radar that this could be a serial killer.
I was so scared. I don't know why. It's just messed up.
Someone in a position of trust who kills people for fun, I can't think of another word other than evil.
My name is Jeff Roberts. At the time, I was a detective at the Tyler Police Department. Tyler is about an hour and 30 minutes just east of Dallas, and it's the kind of place you want to raise a family. It's right here in the heart of the Bible Belt.
Jacob Putman, I'm the Smith County Criminal District Attorney. Tyler's a little over 100,000 people. Christus is one of 2 main hospitals in town. It's a large hospital. They care lots of patients. They had recently built a new heart hospital as a part of that.
I think the most distinctive thing about, which at the time was Trinity Mother Francis, they've since changed their name to Christus, is that we have a very good and well-respected hospital district. Bad outcomes are very uncommon.
I am Kay Blanks, James Blanks' wife. I met him in a bar, but he owned it. And I went there with girlfriends who wanted to teach me how to shoot pool. And he told me I just lit the room up when I walked in. Oh, honey, he was good looking. He was dark brown eyes and dark hair. He had a great head of hair, always did. In fact, there were women that told him they'd like to run their hands through it. And he said, I don't think my wife would like that. But what got him was the heart. We were on a trip to New Orleans when he had the first heart attack. 8 months later, we were in Las Vegas. He had another heart attack. I guess it just got worse and worse. He had a triple bypass. I was there the day of surgery, could not stay the night of surgery, but I saw him the next day, and he was doing well. There was a lady who called me every 30 minutes in the waiting room. She was a nurse, and she would give me his progress about how he was doing. And he was doing good, all the way through. They'd had him up walking. He was sitting in a chair, and when I walked in, he did this to me. He was doing his hand, calling me over, and I walked over to him, and I leaned down and I kissed him, like that, because that's what he wanted. And I want to say this because it's real important to me. The last time I kissed him, it was to be a peg. And when we connected, we did not disconnect. And I thought about that real quickly. And he didn't, how you'll pull away or nothing. And later, I thought about that. God gave us that goodbye. He gave us that goodbye. He died that night. He was the love of my life. And, wow, when he passed away, I was told that by myself at 2 o'clock in the morning. Oh my God. And you know what I thought of? I could never hear him walk in the door and say, Mama, what are we going to eat? Or just whatever his habit was. And I would never, it was closure. I would never see him again. He was gone. He was doing well. I said, what happened? He was doing perfect. He was doing great. What happened? And she said, we don't know. Got the surgeon, got me on the phone. I asked him the very same thing. What happened? And he said, we don't know. Everybody was shocked.
He had woken up. He was verbal, he was alert, he seemed to be doing very, very well. He had FaceTimed his daughter. There were every indication, every expectation that this was somebody who was going to have a smooth recovery.
He was retired, had a loving family, grown children, grandchildren, very well loved, and was on his road to recovery when he crashed. It was an unusual bad outcome. It was an unusual death, not one that they predicted. So when Mr. Lafferty died, it was puzzling to the doctors, and they wanted to try to figure out what the cause was. But at the time, really, they couldn't come up with any answers. They kind of had to shrug their shoulders and say it's undetermined. Ronald Clark was a little bit different from the other patients. He didn't have heart surgery. He had vascular surgery, which meaning not on the heart itself, but on the aorta as it goes down towards the legs. But similar in that he had successful surgery and he should have recovered very quickly.
The doctors were thrilled at the progress he was making. And yet 24 hours after he has his surgery, he's brain dead.
They did a review of the surgery, and really at that point they were not able to come up with any plausible explanation as to why he would have had a stroke and died. Christopher Greenaway was really exceptional in a lot of ways as a patient. He was much younger. He had been a war veteran. He was actually a paramedic. But in terms of heart patients who need heart surgery, he was incredibly healthy and had almost no risk factors associated with his surgery. So when he crashed and died the next day, it was very shocking for the nurses and doctors because he was in such good health. The doctors actually were very frustrated because they didn't have an answer to give to the family. The hospital was definitely trying to figure out what was going on. Any death was unusual. Certainly 4 deaths in this close proximity, highly unusual.
Some people are looking and kind of going, this is not what should happen. Even if there are complications to this heart surgery, these are not the kind of complications we would expect. And some of the patients were doing well, and then they deteriorated.
They did the things hospitals usually do, which is check their equipment to make sure there's no malfunctioning equipment either on the floor or in surgery, checking the medications that they're being given. But everything they would check was working properly and couldn't have caused these injuries. No one in the hospital is suspecting it might have been intentional. It was nearly impossible for them to connect the dots. They decided to upgrade the cameras in the unit. Again, not suspecting intentional behavior, but just thinking, well, if we have better surveillance of the hallways, maybe we can figure out, is it the same piece of equipment, or is it the same nurse, or what could it possibly be?
Anyone who knew Will Davis initially at the hospital or was in his adult life would describe him as the guy next door, give his shirt off his back to help you. The guy sitting behind you at church. Was described as a hard worker. To friends, to co-workers, this was a likable, charismatic, always there person. And so, on face value, had everything going for him.
He bought a bigger house. They were putting in a swimming pool. He bought a new truck. Things that all on the outside look like he's got a great life, high-paying job, and everything was hunky-dory. Despite how it looked on the outside, it was not reality. Will was going through a lot of financial trouble. He had actually declared bankruptcy. He was over $135,000 in debt. He was essentially under enormous pressure to pay off his bills. He was putting the minimum down on his credit cards, and his wife at the time had absolutely no idea. She just thought that he was handling the finances and everything was okay.
I'm Dr. Joni Johnston, a forensic psychologist, and I spend most of my days evaluating violent offenders. William Davis is from Tyler, Texas. He grew up in a pretty close-knit family. He's the oldest of 4 boys. He seems to have a very loving mother, but nothing that was really stood out.
I'm Dr. Brianna Fox. I'm a professor and researcher at the University of South Florida in the Department of Criminology. I'm also a former FBI special agent. Will said that he had a great childhood. He said that he had a lovely family. They were very devout Christians. He said that he was on the football team. This was something that was sort of the beating heart of Tyler, Texas at that time. And he described his childhood as almost idyllic.
As a young man, everybody liked him, and he seemed to be a standout that was going places.
We have Will Davis, who's around 16, 17. He's a normal adolescent, and he is attracted to this 12 or 13-year-old girl. And I think when you look at the age difference and the maturity level, this is something that really would be shocking to most people. I mean, it's really not an equal relationship. We start seeing some things in Will that we haven't seen as much before. And I think one of the things we start seeing is Will having a very strong need to control the people around him.
Her parents did not approve of that because he was too old. He continued to pursue that relationship even though he had been told to kind of move on. Became kind of obsessive about her, and to the point of actually crashing his car into a tree in front of her house. That's when the police got involved, and he got some mental health attention at that point. It did cause him some problems early on.
There's nothing normal about this. I mean, these are red flags they're just waving in the breeze everywhere.
So after high school, he kind of floundered a bit. He went to college, but I think in his words, he sort of felt out of place.
All of a sudden, everything was different. He becomes depressed. He seeks out some antidepressants. He goes to get some help. He's told he's depressed. Then he's told he has bipolar disorder, and he's prescribed a couple of different medications, but really struggling from a mental health standpoint, from somebody who has been diagnosed with a pretty serious mood disorder and is trying to figure out a way to navigate that while he's in college.
So he started college and then dropped out, got married, ended up divorced, but then he got remarried and went back to school and got a nursing degree and was kind of headed on the right trajectory after a few years.
It seemed that Will wanted to become a nurse because there was a lot of job opportunities. It was a relatively stable and high-paying job. These were things that Will seemed to value, as many people do, and it seemed like a good career choice.
Nurses take an oath, and they take their job very serious. I have good friends that are nurses and will tell you how serious they take the ethics of their job and the responsibility of that job.
Will Davis is somebody who is a smart guy. He's made it through nursing school, which is no easy feat. He's now ambitious to go further than that.
He worked at a heart hospital that he specifically was charged with caring for patients after they were recovering from heart surgery. Will Davis was essentially responsible for the day-to-day upkeep of all of these patients. There wasn't really high-risk surgeries occurring there. Also, the heart surgeons that were there were some of the best in the area, and they specifically went to that hospital because it focused only on heart surgery.
One of the most telling things is at one point he texts a colleague to ask if they have any anti-anxiety medication. That tells me two different things. Number one is he's struggling and things are getting harder for him. But also what he says, which is, I need something before I get into trouble. I think that is, as somebody who's worked with many patients with anxiety or depression or whatever, I've never, ever had anybody, no matter how anxious they are or depressed they are, say, I'm about to get into trouble.
Joseph Kalina was an American truck driver. Talking with his family, he loved his job, he loved his family, came out of surgery neurologically intact, had no issues or complications from the surgery, and was put on the ICU wing there at the Heart Hospital for more monitoring. From there, he was in the care of a nurse, Ben Raspberry. We found that for lunch, Ben Raspberry asked Will Davis to watch this patient for him as he went to grab a quick lunch. And as he was coming back from lunch is when the monitor was going off. Joseph Kalina was crashing with this unexplained event. Ben Raspberry was actually in there responding as well while Will Davis was watching outside the room.
The hospital went back and reviewed the footage, and they saw Will going into and out of the room right before the crash, which was concerning.
The devastating part was the video also showed Will Davis staging himself down the hall. There was a TV that he had access to that would monitor and show the vitals for the patients on that wing, and he kept looking up at that, and then he would look down the hall, and then we'd look up at the monitor. Here he was, just like an arsonist, watching his victim suffer. Instead of a response, he waited until the very last moment. One of the last nurses ran in with what they call the crash cart, and that's when he stood up and slowly moseyed his way over to the hospital room and just watch everybody try to save a patient that he just maimed.
When you see the way he acts and the body language on the video, it's certainly hard to imagine somebody doing something like this on purpose to a patient. But certainly to commit a murder and to walk nonchalantly down the hall as if nothing had happened would take someone who is incredibly cold and unfeeling.
When the alarm goes off, he's just standing there watching. All these people are crowding into the room. They're trying desperately to save this individual, and he's just watching, like it's a show.
It's really horrifying to watch, seeing somebody essentially dying before your eyes. So it was even more difficult to imagine how Will could be watching this and not just being horrified, but to be almost elated and dancing.
Will was initially interviewed about his interactions with that patient by hospital staff and gave a story that did not match the CCTV in the case. That was obviously a huge red flag.
Will basically said he really didn't do anything. He turned off an alarm on one of the IV pumps. But they could tell from the instruments in the room that his arterial line had been accessed and touched. The IV pump and the arterial line are on different sides of the bed, so there'd be no reason to touch one when you're really saying you're touching the other. Why would a nurse possibly lie about going into a patient's room? There would be no reason to lie about that unless you had some sort of malicious intent. And when that dawns on them, you then have to re-examine every patient, every bad outcome you've ever had. A nurse with malicious intent is never something that they check for. When they do and they start connecting the dots, then really it just opened up a Pandora's box of patients and what had happened to them. After they realized that he was lying and they went back and checked the surveillance tape, that was when the hospital realized they needed to contact the police.
Right out of the gate it is, we need to prove this man's guilt or innocence, either way, and be okay with that outcome. But we're going to follow the facts.
The police are used to solving crimes, but not this kind of crime. And I'm used to trying murder cases, but not this kind of murder case. So we really needed doctors who were experts in these fields to tell us if we were looking at the right thing or not. So the hospital went through all their patients for the couple years before Will was suspected, and looked at those bad outcomes to see if they thought it fit the pattern of injury that Mr. Kalina had. And they knew something had happened with the arterial line because there was evidence on that machine that it had been manipulated. But they still have to figure out what he's doing with the arterial line.
You know, you have a doctor who is essentially ordering these CAT scans to find out what happened. Why did this patient die? And one of the things that comes up is there are these identifiable markers in the brain that show that there was something introduced, air was introduced into the brain that caused these massive incidents.
Air does not just happen in your brain. Especially the amount of air that was captured with victim Christopher Greenaway was just unexplainable. The suspicion was that air was being injected into the arterial line of patients as they were post-surgery.
And so there's a lot of reasons why that was very hard to detect. The first is the arterial line is not a place where you typically inject anything. Arterial lines are primarily placed after heart surgery to measure your blood pressure. But if you inject air into it, that air will travel up the artery to the highest point in the body, which in a hospital bed is the brain. So as air travels up the arterial line into the brain, it then blocks blood from getting to the brain, which causes a stroke. And then after about 6 to 10 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, that air is then absorbed by the brain. The air is a murder weapon that disappears all on its own.
There was even some work done by the hospitals to quickly get patients that had this unexplained event happen, to quickly get them in for imaging, and in a few cases actually did capture what we know from the radiologists and the experts were air bubbles in the brain of the patients affected. That's where I do give a lot of credit to some of the doctors and their suspicion early on, and the ability to go in and get the right imaging that was so crucial in the case to prove up what was happening here.
The police wanted to make sure they went through everything and see if there were more, how many. And as they went through, they found 4 that they were able to confirm that they had imaging, whether it be CTs or MRIs, that would confirm the kind of injury. And then they found a list of others that they suspected were also injuries caused by Will Davis. The security footage was really the most useful piece of evidence. It's very cold, it's very shocking.
Will Davis is seen very clearly walking down the hall, takes a peek inside of the room that Joseph Kalina is in. Will Davis then takes a peek to see that the other nurses are in the room next door. And Will Davis actually told us he grabbed syringes just prior to walking into that room. He's in there for just about a minute and then walked out. Him being in the room, the video capturing that, and even his own admissions, placing himself in direct care with the patient at the time of the incident was very, very critical.
We would talk to the nurses, whether they were still on his side or not. We would show them that footage, and many of them just broke down in tears. They knew what had happened to that patient and heard his lies, and seeing him walk out the way he did, they would weep, knowing that somebody that they worked closely with was able to kind of do that evil right next to them without flinching.
Over a 6-month period from June until January of 2018, Will Davis was the only nurse on duty at the time of each of the events. Sometimes a nurse would ask Will Davis to watch the patient while they went to the restroom, and then the event would happen. In another case, Will was put in charge of a patient because someone had to run and grab a quick lunch, and then that's when the event happened.
As they found more and more cases that met that pattern, it became more and more clear that Will Davis was a murderer and he'd murdered multiple people.
was a sickening feeling. It was definitely a moment in the investigation that we had no doubt who our suspect was, and we had no doubt that we were dealing with evil.
Police, Will Davis, are you here? Will?
Let me see your hands. Let me see your hands.
Let me see your hands. Step to me first, and we'll get your shirt.
Will initially proclaims that he's innocent. He tells his ex-wife, his mother, his lawyer, everybody that he didn't do it, and he was not only going to fight the charges, but he was going to get his nursing license back and return to work.
None of his colleagues suspected that he had been involved, nor did they think any nurse would have been involved. They all trust each other, and they trust the doctors and nurses they work with.
There was 2 interviews done. He would bring up things that we knew as investigators we were interested in the case, but he would bring up things like the art line or bad surgery outcome. He would get nervous. Detective Weaver at that time, as we were finishing up that interview, just flat out asked him about putting air in the arterial lines of patients, and he would only say, "I won't answer that without my attorney," which was good enough for me to understand we were clearly in the right direction with our investigation. So he lived just outside of Tyler. He was married. They had 2 kids. One had just been born. Living outside of his means appeared to be a problem.
He had a clear pattern of being impulsive with money decisions. That, to us, didn't seem related, but when we talked to psychologists, they said there's a pretty good connection there between sociopaths who know how to be controlled and deliberate in some areas of their life, but are very impulsive and unorganized in other areas of their lives. A lot of his behavior, which to us seemed normal.
What if we good looking one of them say, I'm going to do that?
That was the 2 Roberts.
Those 2 Roberts.
Yeah, 2 Roberts.
The 2 Roberts. I've not something different what I apologize.
It's clear which one's the good looking one.
They said would be typical of a sociopath, that being very friendly, having a short attention span, someone who was very impulsive, and they pointed to these things as being very typical of somebody who turns out to be a sociopath and killing multiple people.
But I think anyone on that investigative team would just remind you that sometimes there is just evil.
When investigators began looking at his electronics, they found searches such as list serial killers by number of victims.
They noticed that he had looked at how to kill someone using air.
He is really developed a compulsion for doing this. And this compulsion and this need to feel good and to feel euphoric and all those, to feel that high, is starting to take over any sense of concerns about his safety or any sense of really a judgment in terms of what he is increasingly exposing himself to.
The community was terrified. I think everyone's had that experience of trusting a healthcare professional, and if they walk in the room with the name tag on, you implicitly trust them, and if they say they need to give you a shot of something, you believe them, and you don't hesitate to think that they don't have your best interests at heart. The idea that someone could intend harm to you in that setting was really terrifying and caused a lot of attention.
I had buried James, thinking he died of complications with his heart. Buried him, 48 years, the love of my life. And then I got a text message one day, and a very good friend called me, and she said, "You need to watch this right now."
At the beginning of the investigation, Christus approached the Smith County District Attorney's Office and the Tyler Police Department with concerns that a nurse may have been involved in intentionally causing harm to patients at one of their hospitals.
When I saw that news And they said, if you knew anybody that was in hospital on the 5th floor, Tyler, Texas, you need to call us immediately. And so I called him right away and immediately got on the phone with one of those attorneys. He said, your story is just like everybody else's. You don't ever expect somebody to walk in and put a needle into your IV to shoot air up into your brain. I thought the gall to saunter around like that, looking at his damage, taking people's lives. When James was killed, there was no camera. What I think is he killed James, and then he got by with it. But he knew exactly how to kill him, how long it was going to take, what to give him.
We could really only go back about a year, because that's how long the hospital keeps the detailed records that we would need to prove it. We were fairly confident this isn't when he started. It was just as far back as we could prove.
You know, I know for everyone when it comes to trial, no matter the case, there's always going to be nerves. You never know what curveball is going to be thrown by the defense.
You never know what a jury's going to do.
I think that Will convinced himself that he could talk himself out of it somehow.
We prepared for this case for 9 months, just preparing witnesses and going through evidence. And then we spent several months picking the jury and trying the case.
To this charge, Mr. Davis, how do you plead?
Not guilty.
It turns out a hospital is the perfect place for a serial killer to hide.
The evidence was very, very clear. The medical evidence backed up everything that the video backed up, and when pieced together, really painted the picture of the serial killer that was running the floors.
I expected them to deliberate a while just because they had a whole lot of information to go over. But we went over it in great detail for several weeks with them. And I think at the end of listening to all of the testimony, all of those doctors and nurses and experts, there really wasn't another conclusion they could come to.
You now have this relief because you know justice has been served, you know he's been found guilty.
From the footage of the hearing, Will seemed very aloof. It wasn't that he was necessarily concerned about the charges and the guilty verdict. It almost seemed like he was either resigned or totally detached from it.
Hello? How are you?
I'm here.
His wife was so devoted to him, she couldn't imagine that he had done this.
What really happened?
I'm not a serial monster, if that's what you're wondering.
She was horrified that he did it, but it was almost impossible for her to wrap her brain around.
That summer, we had a lot of finances. I want you to have a nice house. I want you to have a nice pool. I want you to have a nice car. I want to have a nice truck and a nice car. I want to have all these nice things. And then I had to pressure myself to work so many days. I made sure that people stayed ICU a little bit longer so I could work.
You would never want you to prolong someone's stay just for your financial benefit.
In Will's mind, he thought that he was so in debt, he needed more hours at the hospital to get more money, and the way to get more hours was to have more sick patients. The way to have more sick patients was to essentially harm them to make them stay in the hospital for longer, which would require more overtime from nurses like himself.
It was work, it was money, it's so freaking evil. That just got me caught up, and I got caught up in the wrong. They made some horrible choices.
I did not believe what Will had said about his motive. There was already so much overtime before he engaged in any of this behavior. He was having to turn down shifts because he just didn't have enough hours in the day to work 24/7.
If you're murdering somebody, how is that going to result in more overtime?
And I'm so torn because of the things I've done. And I got myself in such a horrible mess. I'm praying that they'll give me forgiveness.
It's almost like I've done these horrible things that I know people would hate me for, and yet I need to somehow soften it and justify it and rationalize it. And it's just, that always surprises me, because you think, once you cross this line, would you really care? I mean, you're not caring about human life.
Now, let me tell you what the DA told the jury. He said he did not kill those people for money. He said he did it because he liked watching them die.
And then they go into victim impact statements, and now it's the humanization, it's the reality for people to hear precisely the effects of the devastation that Will Davis chose to bring upon his victims. I'll never forget Miss Blanks giving her statement to the court.
I stood there and looked right at him. He has black eyes, it seems like. Held his face kind of like something weird with his hands. When I would talk to him, he would go, and these tears would come down his face. And I said, I am Kay Blanks, James Blanks' wife, your first victim. And I said, my husband did not deserve to die like that. And I said, I forgive you because God tells us to forgive. I told him straight to his face, I said, something's wrong with you, buddy.
And what was so impactful is so often you expect it to be vengeance and anger and all these things. And here was a woman offering forgiveness and really pointing Will Davis to the finality and the eternal decision of his actions. And I'll never forget that, because it did point to the truth of the matter, that there was a higher judge to answer to, and that he better be ready for that. When you look at this type of evil, and these type of conscious decisions made by a person so calculated, so cunning, and so intentional, the death penalty exists for cases like this.
The man is not safe with people. He will kill again.
I felt that he felt bad about what he did, but it was more that he felt that he shouldn't have done it given the consequences. But he didn't really seem to appreciate the gravity of the murders that he had committed and the harm he inflicted on these families and the victims. I asked if there were any other victims, and that was when he confessed to me for the first time that there was an additional victim that happened before this entire string came to awareness of police.
He goes into the room of a 96-year-old woman who has a do not resuscitate sign on her door, and he decides that she's suffering, and he decides he's going to be the one to end that suffering. And so he administers sodium chloride, and he also says that he gives her pain medication to make sure that she doesn't suffer as she's passing away. He frames this as a mercy killing, and so he kills this woman. And nobody has any idea that this has happened.
He told me that he had done it with a completely different method. And that was very interesting to me because it showed that this was not something that came about on a whim.
One of the things that he says I think is very telling is he says, looking back, I think I opened a door that I never should have. What that door was for him is how he felt. He was surprised that he felt a sense of power, a sense of control, and also a sense of relief from this stress. But I think what kept him murdering, what turned him really into a serial killer, was the thrill and the exhilaration and that sense of release and power control that he got when he killed and killed again. Once that sense of exhilaration and euphoria started for him, I think it became like a drug for him. Will Davis, I think, is known for a nurse who murdered 4 patients. But I think it's important to realize that that's the tip of the iceberg. We don't know exactly how many people he may have murdered.
There are certainly others out there that he killed and will never be able to prove. To have a trusted healthcare person do this kind of awful act is really unthinkable. The way he did it with air and the arterial line was so unique and clever that it's just evil. To put that kind of intelligence behind how to kill people is really unnerving. I think Will had to have enjoyed it, or he wouldn't have done it more than once. Someone in a position of trust who kills people for fun, I can't think of another word other than evil.